For over a century, tipping has ingrained itself into American culture. What was once considered a largely European practice has now been fully adopted by Americans and, unsurprisingly, taken to a completely different level. But did you know that the practice of tipping is rooted in racism and enslaved African Americans? Well, today we're going to talk about it. And if you like stories like this, you can find more stories like this at onemyhistory.com. If you'd like to support the channel, you can do so on Buy Me Coffee on my Patreon in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. But without further ado, let's get started. The concept of tipping or offering a gratuity has existed for hundreds of years and differs slightly across cultures, tracing its roots back to the 16th century Tudor period of England, where overnight guests typically would present veils as tips to their host's household staff to show appreciation for their service. As time rolled on, during the 16th to 17th centuries, tipping evolved and became customary in English coffee houses. As the legend goes, eager for swift service, they began to drop coins into a box marked to ensure promptitude, abbreviated to TIP. This is widely believed to be the origin of the term tipping, but it's most likely a myth. So what's the reality? The 17th century European feudal period contributed significantly to shaping today's tipping culture. Tipping was almost non-existent in the United States before the Civil War, but it was commonplace for European nobility to reward service workers with an additional sum of money or a tip. This practice eventually made its way across the Atlantic, arriving on American shores in the late 19th century when wealthy Americans in the 1860s discovered the tradition. Wanting to seem autocratic, these individuals began tipping upon their return to the United States. However, in the years before the Civil War, America was divided into two parts, the North, which was more industrialized, and the South, where slavery had formed the backbone of their economy. The South benefited heavily from the unpaid labor of enslaved Africans. After the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865, marking the end of slavery and led to a period known as Reconstruction. This phase was not only about freeing formerly enslaved African Americans, but assimilating them into American society. However, these issues started to take new forms, one of them being the tipping system that was introduced during the Reconstruction era. When tipping was first introduced to America, it was met with fierce opposition and was derided as un-American. They saw it as a form of bribery and belittled the workers and felt that it was unfair and classist. They questioned why individuals who were already financially struggling were expected to pay an additional tip after their meal. In the 1860s, these anti-tipping views were so strong that they traveled their way back to Europe, and it's one of the reasons why tips are generally unexpected in European restaurants today. Despite this, tipping continued to increase. Still, there were many who were not happy with the tradition. In 1915, 6 states temporarily banned tipping. In 1918, the state of Georgia declared tips as a commercial bribe, meaning that tips given to influence service were against the law. Despite these controversial beginnings, tips continued to be practiced in the southern United States. This adoption across the country was accelerated due to Prohibition. In 1920, there was a nationwide ban on alcoholic beverages that had a ripple effect across society. Prohibition meant that many hotel owners changed their bars into lunch places and started serving food to everybody, especially because these meals were ordered from menus. The owners didn't mind tipping because they no longer saw it as a bribe. Eventually, tipping became socially accepted as restaurateurs soon realized they stood to benefit from the opportunity to subsidize their worker pay with guests' extra money. Due to this, tipping caught on nationally, even in the North, and today it is an expected part of American society. While the tradition of tipping was started by the upper class and copied from Europe, when this custom reached America, it took on a disturbing element for the Black community. Those that didn't end up sharecropping would end up working menial positions. These jobs paid very little, and the staff was expected to survive on the tips they were given by their customers. It's assumed that because they were newly freed slaves, they should be appreciative of any income, even if it wasn't guaranteed. These industries saw tipping as a chance to manipulate the system and essentially continue the institution of slavery by paying their black workers only in tips. Despite the official abolishment of slavery, black individuals continued to struggle with limited economic and social rights. Tipping was just another way to cover up and continue slavery in a different form, reinforcing the idea that black labor was not worth a fair wage and reinforcing black workers to rely on the inconsistent generosity of mainly white customers. George Pullman, who established the Pullman Company in 1859, offered high-class sleeping cars for passenger trains. Starting in 1868, he hired on African-American men, many who were formerly enslaved, as porters. Pullman Company believed that they were ideal for the role of servants. He initially paid them extremely low. They only earned $27.50 a month in 1916. That is roughly about $814 today and would be about the equivalent of $10,000 annually. Despite this fact, they worked almost 400 hours a month. The working conditions were harsh and they were frequently mistreated. However, Pullman encouraged the wealthy passengers of these luxury cars to leave the men tips. Tipping had a substantial impact on the wage practices for African Americans, an impact that still can be seen today. It deepened the economic inequalities between the races, and it began a trend of not providing full minimum wage protections to tip workers. And this is a policy that heavily impacted the black community. Society also often labeled black workers as lazy, but expected white customers to leave them generous tips. It was believed that without tips, the serviceable African-American workers would be extremely poor. Additionally, relying on tips for income made black workers heavily reliant on customer bias, creating a power imbalance that was very reminiscent of a master-slave relationship. The civil rights movement had a dramatic impact on labor laws and how black workers were perceived. Title VII, which is a pivotal part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, made it illegal to discriminate based on race, religion, sex, or nationality concerning jobs or salaries. This law also addressed tipping practices and forced restaurant owners to pay at least tip minimum wage to their staff regardless of how many tips they made. Unfortunately, despite the law's intentions, many tip workers, often African Americans, found themselves earning less than minimum wage, highlighting the persistent racial wage imbalances. Even with these issues, the African American community and civil rights activists welcomed these legislative changes as a vital initial move to recognize the rights of black workers. Today, the way we tip in America has remained almost the same since the establishment of the federal minimum wage for tip workers during the New Deal era. Legislation passed in 1938 required employers to pay tip minimum wage, a wage that, including tips, would equal the federal minimum wage. As time passed, rules in the 1970s encouraged fair payment for restaurant staff. Presently, the federal minimum wage for tip workers is about $2.13, while the primary minimum wage is about $17.25. In the United States, tipping has become not just a custom, but an essential part of a server's income. Generally, patrons tip about 15 to 20% of their total bill as a thank you for good service. According to the Council for Economic Advisors, 98% of customers in the United States leave a tip, and Americans tip more money to restaurant servers than any other country in the world. Sadly, racial bias plays a factor that influences tipping behavior, particularly in America. There is an existing stereotype in the service industry that black people do not tip well. Studies confirm that this bias does impact earnings. A research study done by the Restaurant Opportunity Center United in 2018 revealed that black restaurant workers see about 15 to 25% less in tips than their white coworkers. Similarly, a Cornell School of Hotel Administration highlighted that people are more likely to tip their service workers who share the same racial background. It states that black taxicab drivers get about 1/3 less tips than their white colleagues, and these studies underscore the impact of racial prejudice on tipped earnings. This skewed tipping practice is rooted in a long-standing racial stereotypes. Some people hold misguided beliefs that black people are economically disadvantaged and hence leave them smaller tips. Others feed into the stereotypes about attitudes or behavior of black people while dining out or using their services. This misconception creates a biased two-tier tipping system skewed against African Americans and does not reflect reality. However, there are ways that we can fix this inequality. There's been a huge push to get rid of the tipping industry altogether and instead pay workers a fair wage. This will lessen the wage gap and lower employees' reliance on the tipping system. Although change has been slow, more and more people are having conversations about racial inequality and getting rid of tipping altogether. But of course, there's a lot to do. But it is the legacy of slavery in America that turned the tipping system in the United States from a bonus or an extra on top of a living wage into the wage itself. Thank you. I'm your host, Country Boy. This has been One Mic History. If you like stories like this, you find more stories like this at OneMicHistory.com. Also, if you like to support the channel, you can do so on my Patreon. Buy me coffee in the description below. Give us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts and support the YouTube channel. Peace.